The morning my father told me to get out, I had already been packed for 6 days. The bags were sitting in my closet, pushed behind my winter coats so he wouldn't see them if he walked past. 2 duffel bags and a backpack. Everything I actually needed. I'd been careful about it, taking things gradually, a few items at a time so nothing looked out of place. My university transcripts, my SIM card, my passport. The folder my grandmother had given me 2 years before she died, the one she told me to keep somewhere safe and never let my father know about. I didn't open that folder until the night after the funeral. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I get into it, tell me in the comments, what's the worst thing a parent has ever taken from you? Not something physical, something you can't replace. My father's name is not important. What matters is that he was, for most of my life, a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. That's not a line I came up with. My grandmother used to say it about him. She'd say it quietly, usually when he'd left the room, and then she'd look at me with this expression I didn't fully understand until I was older. It was pity, I think, but also something like a warning. I grew up in Mississauga. We had a house, a real house, not an apartment, on a street lined with Norway maples that turned gold every October. My mother had chosen the neighborhood. She'd grown up in a small town in northern Ontario and had always wanted to live somewhere that felt established, she said. Somewhere with sidewalks and good schools and neighbors who actually said hello. She found all of that on our street. She also found my father, but she'd brought him with her, so that was already decided. My mother left when I was 11. Not dramatically. She didn't pack in the middle of the night or scream at him on the front lawn. She just, gradually wasn't there. First her things started disappearing from the bathroom counter, then her books from the shelves in the living room, then her car from the driveway. My father told me she needed space. I didn't ask what that meant. I already knew it meant she wasn't coming back, so it was just us after that. Me and my father and the house that my mother had chosen, and my father had paid for. A distinction he never let me forget. He said it the first time when I was 13. We'd had an argument about something small, something I can't even remember now, and when I threatened to call my mother and ask if I could live with her, he looked at me and said, "You can go ahead and call her. But this is my house and everything in it belongs to me." I didn't call her. I wasn't sure she'd answer. My grandmother, his mother, started stepping in more after that. She lived about 40 minutes away in Burlington, and she'd drive over on weekends sometimes, and take me out for lunch or to the mall or just for a drive along the lakeshore. She never said anything bad about my father directly. That wasn't her style. But she listened when I talked, and she remembered things I told her, and there was a warmth in her that I had never quite felt at home. When I was 19, I went to university in Halifax. I chose it partly because it was far enough away that I had a real reason not to come home for every holiday, and partly because I genuinely loved the idea of being near the ocean. I studied accounting, practical I know. My father approved, which was unusual. He liked the idea of me being useful. I came home summers because I couldn't always afford not to. Halifax was expensive, and my part-time jobs covered rent and groceries but not much else. My father let me stay in my old room without charging me rent, which he reminded me of regularly, as if the absence of something he could have taken was itself a gift. My grandmother used to call me every Sunday. This continued all through university. She'd ask about my courses, my friends, whether I was eating properly. She'd tell me about her garden and her book club and the new Vietnamese restaurant she'd discovered near her condo that she thought I would love. We made a plan once to go together. We never got the chance. She died in February, 2 days before Valentine's Day, which I always think is an oddly romantic coincidence for a woman who was not particularly sentimental. She had a heart attack in her sleep. The doctors said she probably didn't feel anything. I don't know if that's true or if they just say that, but I've decided to believe it. I flew back from Halifax for the funeral. I was 26 by then. I'd finished my accounting designation the year before and had a decent job at a small firm in Halifax. The kind of job that didn't pay impressively, but had good hours and genuinely nice colleagues. I'd built a life there that I was proud of, even if it was modest. My father picked me up from the airport. He was quieter than usual on the drive, which I attributed to grief. My grandmother was his mother. Whatever else he was, he'd lost her, and I thought I should give him room for that. The house looked the same as it always did. Tidy in a way that felt more deliberate than comfortable. My father had never been messy, but after my mother left he'd become almost rigid about order. Everything had its place. Nothing was out. The kitchen counter was always clear. It used to make the house feel less like somewhere you lived and more like somewhere you were being evaluated. The reception after the funeral was at our house. Family came, and some of my grandmother's friends from her book club, and a few neighbors. I made tea and put out the squares my grandmother's friend had brought, and tried not to stare at the framed photo of my grandmother on the mantel that I'd never seen before, and suspected my father had placed there specifically for the occasion. My uncle, my father's younger brother, arrived late, the way he always did. He shook my father's hand and hugged me for a fraction too long, and then took up residence near the good whiskey. I'd never been close to him. There was something slippery about him that I'd always felt but never been able to articulate. The lawyer called 3 days later. I didn't know my grandmother had a lawyer. I didn't know she had much of anything, honestly. She lived simply, the condo, a modest RSP, some jewelry. I'd assumed whatever she had would go to my father and my uncle equally, and I hadn't thought about it beyond that. The lawyer's name was Mr. Oduya. He had a calm, precise voice and an office in downtown Burlington that smelled like good coffee and old paper. He asked me and my father and my uncle to come in together. My uncle made a joke in the elevator going up. My father didn't laugh. I stared at the floor numbers. Mr. Oduya read the will with the particular neutrality that lawyers seem trained to maintain regardless of the content. My grandmother had left her personal belongings, the jewelry, the furniture, some items of sentimental value, to be divided between my father and my uncle. She'd left her book collection to her friend from the club. She'd left her car to my uncle, which surprised him into an actual smile, and she had left her condo to me. The room got very quiet. The condo was a 2-bedroom unit in a mid-rise building in Burlington, bought 15 years ago, and paid off 6 years later, because my grandmother was precise and disciplined with money in a way that neither of her sons had inherited. Mr. Oduya told us that the current estimated value was just over $580,000, and that the property had been transferred into my name through a separate deed of gift that had been legally registered 3 months before my grandmother's death. She'd known she was sick. She hadn't told us. My father said nothing for approximately 30 seconds, then he said, "That's not right." Mr. Oduya said that it was, in fact, correct, and that the documentation was in order. My uncle was watching my father with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not sympathy, exactly, something more careful than that. On the drive home, my father didn't speak. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the highway and thought about my grandmother, about all those Sunday phone calls, about the folder she'd given me before I went back to Halifax after the previous Christmas, the one she pressed into my hands at the door and said, "Keep this somewhere he won't look." I hadn't opened it until I got on the plane. Inside was a letter. She'd written it by hand, in her careful cursive. She explained that she had been diagnosed with a heart condition, that she didn't want to worry anyone prematurely, that she had been thinking about her life and about what she wanted to leave behind. She wrote about my mother, which surprised me. She said she had always liked her, and that she was sorry things had happened the way they had, and that it was not my mother's fault that she hadn't been strong enough to stay. She wrote about my father gently, the way you write about someone you love, despite knowing exactly who they are. And she wrote about me. She said she'd watched me grow up in a house where love had been rationed like something scarce. She said she wanted to make sure I had something solid, something he couldn't reach. She wrote, "The condo is yours, I've made sure of it. Don't argue about it. Just take it, and build something good." I had folded the letter back into the envelope and held it in my lap for the rest of the flight, watching the clouds, thinking about a woman who had arranged her own death with the same quiet precision she'd used to manage everything else in her life. I hadn't told my father about the letter. I hadn't told him I knew. That night, back at the house in Mississauga, I made dinner. We ate without talking. Afterward, my father sat in the living room, and I washed the dishes and listened to the sounds of the neighborhood through the kitchen window. A dog barking somewhere, a car backing out of a driveway, the ordinary sounds of ordinary evening life. Then he came into the kitchen. He said my grandmother hadn't been well, that she'd been confused in her final months, that a decision like this, leaving property directly to a grandchild, bypassing her own sons, wasn't something she would have done if she'd been thinking clearly. I kept washing the dishes. He said he was going to speak to a lawyer about contesting it. I turned off the tap. I dried my hands on the dish towel. I turned around and looked at him. I said, she wasn't confused. He said I didn't know what I was talking about. I said I had a letter, in her handwriting, explaining exactly what she'd intended and why. I said the deed had been registered legally, 3 months before she died, when she was by all accounts perfectly competent. I said that contesting it would cost him money and time and he would lose. His face changed. I'd seen my father angry before, the tight jaw, the controlled stillness that was somehow more frightening than shouting. But this was something different. This was a man realizing that something he thought he owned had never been his at all. He said, "You're going to take your grandmother's condo and do nothing? Just let it sit there while we." He stopped, reorganized. He said, "I raised you in this house. I paid for everything. Your mother left and I was here and I provided. You owe me." I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the word provided. The way he'd always used it, like it meant something more than it did. Like feeding a child and keeping the lights on was an act of extraordinary generosity rather than the basic minimum of parenthood. I said, "Get out of my house." He didn't yell it, actually. That's the thing people always expect when I tell this story. They expect a dramatic scene, raised voices, something cinematic. But he said it quietly, which was somehow worse. Very calm, very certain, like he'd been saving it. I nodded. I said, "Okay." He blinked. I don't think he expected that. I went upstairs to my old room. I pulled the 2 duffel bags and the backpack out from behind my winter coats. I checked that the folder with my grandmother's letter was in the front pocket of the backpack. It was. I carried everything downstairs in 2 trips. My father was still in the kitchen. He watched me come down the stairs the first time, and then the second time, and he didn't say anything. I think he'd expected me to argue, or to cry, or to come back and tell him I was sorry and that I didn't mean it. I'd done that before, in other arguments. I'd always been the one to de-escalate, to make peace, to absorb things. Not this time. I booked a hotel room in downtown Mississauga on my phone while I was standing in the front hall. The Marriott on Hurontario, 2 nights, because I wasn't sure yet what my next move was, but I needed somewhere to think. I called a cab. I didn't have a car in Mississauga. I'd stopped keeping one there years ago. And I waited on the front step with my bags. My father came to the door once. He stood in the doorway and looked at me sitting on the step with my bags and he said, "You were already packed?" Yes. He didn't say anything else. He went back, didn't slam. He just closed it, quietly, the same way he'd said everything else that evening. The cab came 12 minutes later. I got in, put my bags in the trunk, and watched the house get smaller in the rear window as we pulled away. The Norway maple in the front yard was bare in February, just dark branches against the streetlights. I thought about October, the way it used to look when the leaves turned. My mother had planted that tree. It was the one thing of hers that had stayed. I cried in the cab. Not from grief, exactly, or not only that. It was more like release, the way you breathe out after holding your breath for a very long time without realizing it. At the hotel, I ordered room service, which I almost never did, because it felt like the right night for it. I sat on the bed with a bowl of pasta and called my best friend Cora, not from the file, just Cora, my person from Halifax, who picked up on the second ring and listened for an hour and a half without telling me what to do, which was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I called Mr. Oduya. I told him what had happened. He wasn't surprised. He said the deed was clean, the will was ironclad, and my father had no grounds for a challenge. He also told me something I hadn't known, that my grandmother had included a specific clause in the documentation, instructing that if any legal challenge was mounted against the transfer, a portion of her remaining liquid assets, currently held in trust, would be directed to a charity of Mr. Oduya's choosing rather than to either of her sons. She had anticipated this possibility. She had planned for it. I laughed for the first time in days. It wasn't a happy laugh exactly. It was more like recognition. That was her. That was entirely her. I stayed in Mississauga for another week. I met with a property management company about the condo. My grandmother's furniture was still in it, and I wasn't ready to make permanent decisions yet. I had a job in Halifax, a life there. I needed to think carefully about what I actually wanted. What I didn't do was call my father. He called me once, 4 days after I'd left. I saw his name on my phone screen and I sat with it for a moment, watching it ring. I thought about every time I'd picked up, every time I'd smoothed things over, every conversation that ended with me swallowing something I should have said. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. My uncle texted me the following week. He said my father was not doing well and that it might be worth a conversation. I texted back that I hoped my father was okay and that I would reach out when I was ready. My uncle didn't respond to that. I flew back to Halifax on a Thursday. My colleagues at the firm had sent flowers while I was gone, for the funeral, and there was still one arrangement left on my desk. A little sad-looking by then, but still there. I sat down, opened my laptop, and stared at my screen for a few minutes before I could actually start working. I'm telling you this part because I want to be honest about what the following months looked like. They weren't triumphant. I didn't go home to a parade. I sat with a grief that was complicated and strange, Grief for my grandmother, obviously, but also something slower and more ambiguous. Grief for the father I had never quite had. Grief for the version of things where he had been different. Where the house had been a home. Where I hadn't felt like a tenant in my own childhood. I thought about what I actually wanted to do with the condo. I thought about it for almost 2 months before I made any decisions. In the end, I decided to move back to Ontario. Not to Mississauga. I was done with Mississauga, but to Burlington, which was where my grandmother had lived, where I'd spent the best afternoons of my childhood driving along the lakeshore and eating bad diner food and feeling genuinely loved. I found a job at a mid-sized accounting firm in Hamilton. I negotiated to start in 4 months, which gave me time to wrap things up properly in Halifax. The condo needed some updating. I spent 2 weekends painting. Just 2 rooms, the living room and the second bedroom. And I kept most of my grandmother's furniture because it was good furniture, and because I liked having her things around me. I kept her reading chair especially. It's by the window in the living room now, and in the evenings when the light comes in at an angle, it looks exactly like it did in her old place, and sometimes I sit in it and feel very close to her. My father and I haven't spoken. It's been 14 months. I thought I would feel guilty about this more than I do, but mostly what I feel is something quieter. Not anger, not satisfaction, just distance, like a door I used to stand outside of, always hoping it would open, and one day I just walked away and found other doors instead. I ran into my uncle at a grocery store in Burlington once, about 6 months after everything. He looked surprised to see me. We talked for a few minutes. He asked how I was. I said I was well. He said my father had mentioned trying to reach me. I said I knew. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but didn't. I've thought about whether I made the right choice, not about the condo. That was my grandmother's decision, and she made it carefully and legally, and it wasn't mine to refuse. But about leaving, about not going back, here's what I keep coming back to. I didn't want the property. I mean, I'm glad to have it. I'm not going to pretend that having a home in a city where I want to live, paid off, at 31 years old, isn't a remarkable thing that changes everything. It does. It has. But that's not why I didn't fight for it. I didn't fight because there was nothing left to fight for. What I wanted for a very long time was a father who saw me, who called me on Sundays the way my grandmother did, who noticed when I was struggling, who once, just once, said that he was proud of me without it being attached to something I'd done for him. That's what I actually wanted. I never got it. And somewhere between the kitchen and the front step and the cab pulling away down that quiet February street, I finally stopped waiting for it. My grandmother knew. She knew long before I did. And she couldn't fix what he was. Nobody could. But she could make sure that when I finally stopped waiting, I would land somewhere solid. I live in her condo now. I sit in her reading chair. I grow tomatoes in containers on the balcony that face east, the way she used to, and every Sunday morning I make a pot of coffee and sit with it while the light comes up over the escarpment, and I talk to her a little. In my head, the way you do with people who are gone but not really gone. I tell her the tomatoes are doing well this year. I tell her I'm okay. I tell her she was right about everything. She always was.